Hello everybody, my name is Joshua Winkins and welcome back to another video. Now in this video I want to give you an overview of whether or not the Panasonic G7 is still worth it in 2020. Now if you're new to this channel, I create Final Cut Pro tutorials, filmmaking tutorial videos, and camera gear reviews. So if those type of videos interest you, highly encourage you to go ahead, hit that subscribe button, because I will be giving away a free Google Home Mini once I reach 1,000 subscribers. That's a really good incentive to go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Now in this video I want to go over 6 pros of the camera and then fortunately 5 cons of the camera, because like everything there's pros and cons to absolutely everything, and I want to give you both sides, both the positive sides and the negative sides of this camera. Now this camera comes in around $500–600 depending on where you're buying it from and if there's a sale or a discount or Black Friday. It just depends, but $500 is often the average price for this camera. It is also a micro four thirds camera, which means there are some advantages, but there are also a couple of disadvantages to being a micro four thirds camera. Now one thing to keep in mind is that for a camera that only costs $500, there are a lot of pros to a camera that literally only costs $500. I believe there's a lot more pros than there are cons of this camera. The first pro I want to go over is the cheapness of it. This camera is a really cheap camera, and it's a really great camera for people who are just getting into the world of film and just kind of want a cheap and kind of budget camera. Now pro number 2, depending on how you look at it and what you're comparing it to, is this camera has a 16 megapixel sensor, which obviously it just depends on what kind of camera you're comparing it to, but if you compare it to like your iPhone, the sensor is a lot better than an iPhone camera. I mean, obviously it all varies depending on who you look at, but for a camera that only costs $500, a 16 megapixel camera is actually pretty good. I feel like a lot of cameras around that price range don't have a 16 megapixel camera. So the second pro is the megapixels of this camera are actually not that bad for a camera that literally costs $500. The third pro is this camera can shoot at 4K 24 frames per second. 4K is the future of film when you obviously want to start shooting your videos in 4K. So for a camera that only costs $500 and can shoot in 4K, I think that's a really big advantage when you compare it to other cameras that cost like $500. And the fourth pro of this camera is what's called a 4K photo burst mode. Now I'm not going to go through the settings of the actual what 4K photo burst mode is. You can go ahead and kind of look it up or try to find other videos. Maybe I'll try to find a video that I'll link it to so you can go ahead and watch, figure out how to completely set it up. But what it just basically does is it helps you take like these fast moving pictures. So if you're like a basketball game or a soccer game, what it does is you can put it into that setting, hold down the button, and then just it takes pictures really fast. So you take like 700 images. Then what you do is after you're done, you scroll through until you find the best image where it's not as blurry as it possibly can. It's a $500 camera, so you might get a little blur, but it just helps you take those stop motion, action, sportsy type of pictures. Now the fifth pro of this camera is it's a mirrorless camera. So what that basically means is this camera is very small, compact, and lightweight. That to me is a really big advantage. I know from experience, I've actually had experience able to film on live football games and actually having to use like the handheld cameras. Those things are a pain. They're incredibly heavy. So to be able to have a camera that's very lightweight, very small, very compact, I think that's a really big advantage, especially nowadays where most of these cameras just are so heavy, they're just so big. It's nice every once in a while to have a camera that's very light and compact. Now the sixth pro of this camera is its flip out touch LCD screen. Now obviously it's a touch screen, so I mean you can obviously touch the screen, but what this helps you do is if you want shots in focus, better exposure, all that stuff, a touch screen to me is really helpful. Now obviously there are buttons if you want to go ahead and use them, but the ability to actually have a touch screen I think is a really good advantage. Also, this is a flip out LCD screen, which means you can see yourself to make sure you're in focus, make sure your shot's not too overexposed, so it helps with these type of videos. Or if you're vlogging, I think it's a really big advantage to be able to see yourself. It just helps make sure your shot's in focus and all that stuff, and you don't need somebody else to make sure your shot is in focus. A lot of these $2,000 Sony cameras don't even have a flip out LCD screen. I think that is a really big pro of this camera. Now, believe it or not, when you buy a camera that only costs $500, unfortunately, there's gonna be some downsides, but that's expected when this camera literally costs under $1,000. But none of these cons are so big they should deter you from completely buying this camera. It is still a really good camera. Now, the first con is this camera is not weather sealed. All this means is don't take this out in really harsh conditions like pouring rain. Don't throw it in the ocean. Like, as long as you don't put it under extreme weather conditions, this camera is completely fine. You can probably do it in some light rain or snow, but just don't use this camera in heavy rain. You're most likely going to end up breaking this camera. Now, the second con of this camera is it's micro four thirds. All that means is it's cropped in. So for example, I'm using a 25mm lens. I believe, I have to go ahead and flash them on the screen if I'm wrong, but I believe it's a 2x crop. So instead of a 25mm lens, it's actually being cropped in, and now it's acting like a 50mm lens. The only problem with that is the camera's gonna have to be farther away than you think. And if you're doing vlogging, you want to get a really wide lens, because even like a 7mm lens is like a 14mm lens. Just something to make sure of. If you're doing vlogging, or if you want to be really far away from the camera, you want to get a really wide lens. That's not that big of a deal. We just gotta keep that in your head when you're going out and buying this camera. The third problem with this camera, the third con, is it doesn't have amazing autofocus. Now, you can get better lenses, or you can have somebody else manually focus the camera. The only problem is this is just a problem when you're trying to do vlogging. A lot of times it'll be out of focus, but you can just get a better lens. Bottom line is, it's just not going to be a Sony A7 autofocus speed. You have to give it some time to focus. That's just a small little problem, but something you definitely want to be aware of when you're trying to buy this camera. Now, the fourth problem with this camera is it doesn't have image stabilization. That just means you're going to have to get an image stabilized lens, or get some kind of gimbal or Steadicam or monopod. I believe it's called a monopod. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it just means you just can't do handheld footage. It doesn't have image stabilization as like a Sony camera. Just something to keep in mind. Make sure you do your best to get accessories that help stabilize your camera. Now, the fifth and last con of this camera is it can only shoot at 60 frames per second, so it can't go up to 120 or 240. This just means your slow motion isn't going to be as like cinematic as like a Sony camera. Now, I keep comparing this to a Sony camera. It's $500, but just something to keep in mind. So those are just my top 5 cons of the camera. None of these problems I think are absolutely massive. I think this camera is still really worth it. The only thing I would say is if you're doing vlogging or travel cinematic handheld footage, this probably isn't the camera for you. It's probably just a good camera to learn. You want to put on a tripod, do talking headshot videos, tech unboxings. I think when this camera's on a tripod and it's a really good autofocusing lens, this camera is just as fine as a Sony camera. The only downside is maybe the image won't be as sharp, but saying all those cons, this camera is still really worth it. Anyways, guys, hope you guys really enjoyed this video. If there are some questions that you still want answered, go ahead and comment them down below, and I'll try to respond to them as soon as this video comes out. Make sure you go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I'm doing a Google Home Mini giveaway at 1,000 subscribers. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to leave a like, comment, anything you want to do, share the video. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!